Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Joan Didion referred to California as the Golden Land, the place where the dream was teaching the dreamers how to live, a metaphor for some larger insidious process at work in American history, one that became a parable of the American penchant for reinvention and for discarding history and starting tabula rasa. That may have once been true for California. But today, in which California is the fifth largest economy in the world, what happens in California doesn't stay in California. The state's actions and leadership often resonate around the globe in ways that makes its history important. And one of the things that's so important to that history is the Brown family and its relationship to California. In fact, in the 59 years since 1959, 24 of those years have seen a Brown running the state of California. The Brown family history is part of who we are as a state. They reflect how we've evolved. A reminder that, again, as Didion said, it had better work out here because it's where we run out of continent. We're going to talk about that combined history today with my guest, Miriam Pawel. She's the author of the previous book, The Crusades of Cesar Chavez, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor and reporter who spent 25 years at Newsday and the Los Angeles Times. And it is my pleasure to welcome Miriam Pawel back to this program to talk about her latest work, The Browns of California, the family dynasty that transformed a state and shaped a nation. Miriam Pawel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Delight to have you here. I want to talk first about some of the themes that you touch on and uncovered in the course of your reporting of this, some of the themes that parallel both the state and the Brown family as they evolved over the years.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you framed it that way because that is exactly what I wanted people to come away from the book with, and it's what gave me the idea to do a collective biography as history, because there is so much, as you pointed out, the Browns played an enormous role in shaping the state, but there's also so much about their family history that parallels the arc of the state itself. And I tried to write the book by sort of to interweave those stories by identifying those key themes. And just parenthetically, the book actually starts with Jerry Brown's great-grandfather, August Shuckman, who arrived in California in 1852. So we have the arc of the four generations. And very briefly, I would say that, some of the themes specifically would be that idea of California that you alluded to early on, in the sense of how it was formed, how it, in the words of Carrie McWilliams, the lights went on in a blaze, after the gold rush and have never dimmed. That's a paraphrase. The idea of the land of opportunity and what has drawn so many people to California over the decades, and then things like the importance of higher education and the influence on it in the University of California, the state as a land of immigrants and the significance of immigration here, and the outdoor world and the environment and its importance in California, which is so different than in many other parts of the country like the East Coast.
Talk a little bit about Pat Brown and his emergence into politics. How did he come to the political world?
Pat Brown grew up in extremely modest circumstances. He was the son of about second-generation immigrants, one Irish, one German, born in San Francisco in 1905, a year before the earthquake, and just your classic old-style politician who began to run for things when he was in junior high school and loved to be around people, loved the political world, and began life as a Republican, ran his first race for assembly unsuccessfully as a Republican when he was 23 years old, became a Roosevelt Democrat, and was first elected to the office of San Francisco District Attorney. That was his first successful race in 1943. His son, Jerry, was 5 years old at the time, and from there progressed through the San Francisco political world, became Attorney General, and then governor in 1958.
It's interesting to see how he came to represent, certainly steered the state through, but also in a way came to represent that post-war enthusiasm of California.
Absolutely. He was just an ebullient personality and sort of the perfect leader for that period of time in those post-war years when California was growing. During the decade of the 50s and 60s, it was growing by 1,000 people a day who were coming here and 1,000 babies who were being born. The combination of that post-war migration plus the baby boom, the growth at a phenomenal rate. I mean, the amount of construction of schools and roads and cities that were needed to accommodate that boom was enormous. And he had, as you said, that this just expansive, gregarious, ebullient personality that was perfect for that era, and that optimism, that ability to say, we can come to an agreement between North and South that will allow us to construct the State Water Project, which he was very instrumental in pushing through early in his first term. And the university system, the master plan, there were 3 entire campuses that were designed and launched and nearly completed under his tenure, which is just, sort of remarkable to think about today, how fast things happened.
What did he understand? What did Pat Brown understand about the future of California? How much of it was being caught up in the moment and all of this enthusiasm, as we're talking about, all these things that needed to be done given those boom years? And was there any part of it that was reflective as to where all this was headed for California?
Well, I think water would be the example there, where he was very determined to push through the State Water Project in order to provide water to Southern California, which was absorbing the bulk of the growth at that point. But still, it was a period when the power and the weight within the state was just shifting from north to south. And he was, even at the time, there were people who sort of said, it's a desert, you shouldn't have that much water there. We don't want to encourage people to live in a place that's not naturally hospitable. But Pat's position was they're going to move there with or without water. And, we need to have water there because they're going to come anyway. And so I think while he was not a visionary in a kind of a classic sense in terms of being, perhaps not the kind of visionary that his son was, he did have that longer horizon and say, this has to be done to plan for the state. And similarly, in terms of the higher education system, we must have universities that are going to be able to educate this incredible baby boom that is coming up. So I think that he did take some actions that, we're living with. The state master plan was subtitled 1960 to 1975, and it's still the governing document on all 3 systems of higher education today for the most part. So he did foresee that enormous growth. And growth at that point also was considered a good thing for the most part. So there was a different view of the expansiveness at that point in time.
You mentioned the vision aspect of it. It's interesting that even Jerry Brown, and he was, 19 or something when his father became governor, that he, and you portray this in a letter, I think, that he wrote to his father when he was thinking about running for governor, as to how he saw his father, how he saw California, how he saw his father might make a contribution.
Mm-hmm. So Jerry Brown, as many people, but maybe some of your younger listeners don't remember, was a seminarian and went into a Jesuit seminary for 3.5 years, from 1956 through the beginning of 1960. So he was actually in the seminary when his father ran for and was elected governor in 1958. And there are a series of letters that he writes. Even though he was cloistered and shut off from the political world, he managed to follow politics even then. He was very, because of being a Jesuit seminarian at the time, sort of counseled his father about how he could, in what capacity, whether it was for governor or Senate, and that was a big debate at the time, but Pat was trying to decide which race to make, how he could best serve his country and state. And I do think that for the differences between the generations and the personalities and so forth, that there are common values, and one of them throughout the Brown family, including other siblings and names that we're less familiar with because they played less of a role in our state political system, that value of public service was something that was very much sort of imbued in the family that idea that you have a responsibility to be of service to your state, and that sort of affection for California that was very genuine, and belief in the importance of public service.
Talk about Pat Brown's affection for California, how he saw the state.
He was, I always say that it's hard to find anyone who rivaled Pat Brown in his affection and his chauvinism for California. He just simply, embodied in many ways the idea of California exceptionalism, that there was sort of no place on earth one would rather live. He did travel extensively in his later age, but he just really, it was the people and the land. He grew up as a child spending a lot of time in Yosemite and then later on in the Russian River, had a real affinity, went backpacking in the wild at a fairly advanced age, and brought his family when he and his wife Bernice had 4 children, and they spent summers in either Yosemite or the Russian River, and really transmitted that to his family as well, that sort of sense of affection for the place. And the classic story about him is that he used to love to fly in the state propeller plane, which was called the Grizzly when he was governor, and there are photos of him peering out the window with binoculars and just looking at the land. He famously wrote a letter to Ronald Reagan, who defeated him in 1966 and succeeded him as governor, criticizing him for getting rid of the state plane, the propeller plane, because he wanted to fly in a jet, and saying you can't see the land that way. You can't get a sense of the place. So he really embodied that idea.
And to what extent was that conveyed to Jerry? Talk about his relationship to the state of California.
I think it's hard to underestimate the degree to which one absorbs things by osmosis as a child, and both that sense of California and also of the political world. That was the house that Jerry grew up in. His father was first elected to office in 1943 successfully, but he had run for district attorney 4 years earlier in 1939. Jerry was 1 year old. So, his entire life growing up was in a house that was all about politics and all about California. And that's, very much something that became part of him and the rest of his family. And I think one of the examples of that is the land in Colusa County where Jerry's great-grandfather, August Schuckman, ended up. He ended up as an innkeeper on a ranch in Colusa, which is called the Mountain House. And that land, which he acquired in the 1870s, remained in the family ever since. Pat Brown and his brother managed to sort of scrape together enough money and get together some wealthier friends to help them to buy the land when their grandfather died. And that is the place on which Jerry Brown is building his retirement home and has been spending a lot of time, because that is the ancestral home, and he feels a real attachment to that land and to the ability to walk in the place where his grandmother was born. That means a lot to him.
What sense did Jerry Brown have of how California had changed when he became governor? How different a place it was from that California that his father became governor of in 1959?
Well, I think perhaps one of the best ways to convey that is that there was a book by E.F. Schumacher called Small is Beautiful. That was required reading for his staff when he became governor in 1975. He very much embraced the idea that this was an era of limits. It was no longer that expansive world. 8 years of Reagan in between, and there was a very different world and a sense that a lot of the problems that people had come to California to escape had followed them here. Smog had become an enormous problem at that point. Traffic was a problem. Development was a problem. And the financial resources of the state, which sort of for Pat had seemed, limitless. And by the way, he left a fairly large deficit for his successor. All of that was changed, and the mood of the country was changed, and Jerry Brown very much embraced that, somewhat to the distress of his father. Prop 13 was passed in 1978, which was sort of in the middle, just before Jerry ran for re-election for his second term, and there was that sense very strongly that that we were in a different era, and he certainly talked about that, embraced it, and on an environmental level as well. I mean, when Pat Brown was governor, there was no CEQA, there was no environmental movement, so you were able to build roads and bridges and tunnels and water aqueducts without any kinds of environmental reviews. And of course, that had changed also by the 1970s. So, very different landscape.
Do you think in the case of both of them at the times they were governor, that they were more reflective of the times or helped shape the times in California?
I think you have to say both. I mean, it's difficult to separate that out. As we talked about, certainly Pat Brown was very much a product of his times and embodied that spirit, but also, the legacy that he left in a very physical sense was incredibly instrumental in shaping the state and future generations. And I think one could sort of parse Jerry Brown the same way. In many ways, he has a much longer horizon than his father, and certainly than most politicians. I mean, I think that one of the things that makes him unusual, and there are many things that make him unusual as a political figure, but one of them is that he really is very far-sighted and always has been, and sometimes he sees different, his vision has changed over the years, but that ability to look beyond the next election and to really be looking far ahead, and to say early on, every child is going to have a computer. It's going to be like having a pen. So he was sort of an early adapter of the technology that was going to reshape our society in the state. Or certainly solar power is a good example of something that he talked about a lot the first time around, and people thought that was a little wacky, and now, of course, it's utterly mainstream. So I think that he is a product of his times, as we all are, and I mean, I think to some degree it's probably a tautology, because you don't get elected to a high office unless you represent the mood of the times, but certainly both of them did a lot to shape, both the physical and more intangible aspects of the state.
Talking about shaping, one of the things that seemed to be the most profound for Jerry was his time as mayor of Oakland. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, there are two things that if you ask any of his close friends or people who followed him closely, the difference between his first two terms from 75 to 82 and his current terms that he's finishing now, the answers are Anne, who is his wife. He married Anne Gust in 2005, Anne and Oakland. And he spent 8 years as mayor of Oakland, was elected in 1998 for the first time. And that experience of running a city for someone who had jumped into politics at a very high level because of his name, or his name enabled him to make that leap to statewide office. In 1970, he became Secretary of State after only 1 year on the Los Angeles Community College Board, not a jump that most people could make. He skipped that whole sort of phase of having any experience with local government, which is more common for politicians to have. And for him, that for someone who focuses as intently as he does on whatever he happens to be doing at the moment, bringing that intensity to Oakland, to the issues of housing, of development, of urban redevelopment, and particularly of the criminal justice system, a major problem then and to a lesser degree now in Oakland, really shaped his thinking about state policies and about how policies and laws that are made in Sacramento affect people on a local level, and how they play out sort of on the ground, so to speak.
It's interesting when, people used to try and write about Richard Nixon years ago. Nixon's answer to authors always was, "Don't put me on the couch." What was it like talking to Jerry Brown about this legacy? You spent quite a bit of time with him in writing this.
So for me, I did a lot of work on the book before I really talked to him. We had one conversation with him early on, and then I actually didn't talk to him for a couple of years while I researched the book largely in archives and to a degree also talking to people. And so in my conversations with him, I was really interested in trying to understand what experiences were important to him. I mean, I find in interviewing people in general, people will talk about the things that matter to them. So that was one of the things that interested me, and in sort of seeing how his mind works and what kinds of leaps it makes. One often has pretty non-linear conversations with him, which were very useful for my purposes because I wanted to see the kinds of connections that he made and where he went from one subject to another, and who were the people and the events and the issues that he would come back to. He has a very good memory, very accurate memory. Also another unusual aspect of him as a politician is that most politicians kind of invent their own stories at some point, and sort of are prone to embellishment. His father was certainly one of those people, and there was one has to parse a lot of what Pat Brown said to kind of, fact check it. Sherry Brown, as he said to me at one point, does not like embellishment. And I think that's his personality and his Jesuit training, that he's very fact-based. And so that was very helpful for me as a researcher and historian.
It's easy, as we've talked about, to kind of pigeonhole Pat Brown as reflective of those post-war boom years in California. And certainly Jerry Brown's first tenure as governor reflected the 60s and so much that was happening in that period. How does he see this second tenure, this second period as governor? And what is that reflective of as he sees it, as you see it?
Okay. It's always harder to talk about the present, and certainly for me, I mean, I'm very aware, as a journalist turned historian, I'm very aware of the phrase of journalism is the first cut of history. So I've tried to avoid any kind of real evaluation of his second term in that sense. Of there are things that are happening now that I think are going to play out, and it's going to be up to future historians to look back on it. So, but with that caveat, I would say, California, as you said early on, plays this, enormous role now. And to some degree it always has, but as the world's fifth largest economy in this incredibly technologically driven world right now, California's policies are important in shaping actions and policies throughout the country and throughout the world. And so I think that he has been a leader for that time. If you look at climate change, for example, and in the environmental sphere as a whole, the way in which California has set policies and played a leading role in those efforts, particularly climate change, is a good example of the times that we are in and the role that the state plays. I would, single out climate change and perhaps the immigration as another very key area. The demographic changes in California, which would have been, so enormous and profound over the decades, the idea that California is a majority minority or whatever the term we use, but, the percentage of Latinos and Asians in California and the degree to which, although immigration has slowed, they have been an enormous force in shaping the state. And Sherry's I think if you look, for example, at some of the strongest language that he has used in the wake of the election of President Trump was about protecting immigrants in this state regardless of their legal status and how important that is to him. I think that's also a core value both of the family and goes back generations, but also a reflection of California's sort of role as the center of that particular sort of fight, because the demographic changes in California tend to spread east as they have from here. So I would say sort of immigration and the environment being two areas in which you can really see that he, as a leader has, he pushed through, for example, was instrumental in the bill in signing and encouraging the legislature to pass the bill that allowed undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a good example of something that, very reflective of the times.
Are you surprised that other members, certainly Kathleen made a stab at it, but other members mm-hmm. of the Brown family have not pursued politics to the same degree?
Not really. Kathleen did have a major political career, really, as a school board member and then as state treasurer, and then in her unsuccessful but very prominent run for governor in 1994 against Pete Wilson, which was the year of Prop 187, again, back to the immigrant theme, and she lost in part because of her very strong stand against Prop 187. So she has been a major figure in her own, a political figure in her own right. Am I surprised by the others? Not really. There were, Pat and Bernice had 4 children. Their oldest 2 did not go into politics on their own. The oldest daughter, Barbara, in fact, very explicitly rejected that world and wanted to have a very separate identity. And her sister, Cynthia, was a very big supporter of all of the political Browns, but did not pursue a career on her own. In the next generation, Pat Brown's grandchildren, his oldest granddaughter, Kathleen Kelly, is a judge in San Francisco, has been very involved in juvenile justice issues, and a couple of the other grandchildren are teachers. So that, I think those values of public service and also attachment to the outdoor world were passed on, but not not that sort of. In a way, I think that reflects the difference in this dynasty from, say, the Kennedys, where there was much more of a sense that you were born to that particular seat in Congress or in the House of Representatives or whatever. It was almost an entitlement, and that's not been the pattern or the history of the Brown dynasty.
I would assume dynasty is not a word that Jerry Brown particularly cares for. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think he has I hesitate to speak on this because I don't think we ever discussed it directly, but I don't think he has a problem with that concept. I think he sees himself very much, he's very interested and has spent a lot of time tracing his own family history, and I think he sees the role that his family has played in the state as a very important one, and I think he sees his career as part of that trajectory. So I don't think he would have the same issues with that word as he does with legacy, which is a different a different concept.
Right. What is it about that idea of a legacy that he seems so uncomfortable with?
Good. I'm glad you asked. So here's the thing about legacy as far as he's concerned, that a legacy is something that you leave when you stop being an actor on the stage, when you stop doing things. And he does not intend to stop doing things until he's dead. Therefore, he doesn't have a legacy now. He will have a legacy at some future time, and he won't be around to see to hear about that. But to him, legacy is something that happens when you stop being active in the political and social and moral world.
How do you think that he will do in retirement? What do you think we'll expect to hear from him?
I think he will find plenty of things to keep himself occupied and interested. I mean, he has that sort of relentless, restless intellectual curiosity and focus and sort of intensity, and he will continue to find things and surround himself with people who he finds interesting and stimulating to talk to, that he will continue to be a voice and a leading voice in sort of trying to mobilize people to combat what he sees as what are the two existential threats to our existence, climate change and nuclear proliferation. He has been a very, active and powerful voice on those issues and will continue to do so. And I think he will explore everything about Calusa and his ranch that he possibly can until he has exhausted that subject, and then he'll find another one.
And does he have any regrets? Are there any regrets across the board about not succeeding at higher office?
I assume, how could there not be regrets on some level? One runs for president 3 times. It means you really want to be president. But I personally don't sort of sense any discontent. I think if you look at the role that he has played, and perhaps this is also a reflection of the point you made earlier about sort of how leaders embody and represent their times, that his role on an issue like climate change has been, and in some ways as sort of the anti-Trump, has been to be the leading Democrat in the country running the world's 5th largest economy. So that's not I think he's pretty content with that perch.
And finally, as you talk to him, who does he admire in the political realm? Besides his father, who did he look up to? Who were models for him?
I don't have a good offhand answer on that. I'd have to think about it more. I certainly admired Earl Warren. I think that in terms of being governor, the governors whom he looked up to and admired were his father and Earl Warren and Hiram Johnson. Those are sort of the outstanding governors of the state in many ways. And the one thing that they all embodied, which I think he has tried to emulate, is a sense of a spirit of bipartisanship also that reflects both the sort of different role and the much lesser role that political parties play in California, but also that embrace of all of California, that if you are governor, you represent everyone, including the people who didn't vote for you, that while Republicans have been very respectful of the idea that there are Republicans in this state, they may not be a major political force, but they matter too. They are part of the state. They count. They need to be reached out to and listened to. And so I think that he very much respects that tradition of governing in the spirit of the party of California, as the late great historian Kevin Starr called it, and that is something that has been very important to him. And those are the 3 sort of governors whom he has admired and sought to emulate in that respect.
Miriam Pawel, her book is The Browns of California, the family dynasty that transformed a state and shaped a nation. Miriam, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.